Hello, thank you so much for being on today. My name is Ashlyn Hilliard, and I am really looking forward to sharing this program with you. Just a couple of things before we dive in. I wanted to present to you a little bit of the overlapping structure of this presentation today, what we're going to cover and where we're going. And I'll get into a little bit about my background as well. Before I do any of those things, I wanted to offer a little bit of a content warning. In this discussion, we will be talking about some pretty difficult topics, such as reproductive coercion, intimate partner violence, issues such as sexual assault. And so I just ask that you kindly take care of yourself and prioritize yourself. I will be having a recording of this, so if you need to step out at any time and you wanted to take it in chunks or catch it later for any reason, I would be happy to share that with you after the streaming of this program today. Thank you again for being here. I'm so excited that you have such interest in a topic such as reproductive coercion. It's not one of the funnest topics I realize to be talking about today, but I want to make it a topic that is approachable, is understandable, is easily digestible, whether you're an academic, a student, or if you're neither of those things and this is your first time hearing about reproductive coercion and you just want to know about what it's about, what does it mean, and what are its implications. So I wanted to sort of cater my presentation today to sort of reach a wide variety of audiences, of those of you who are interested and are attending in the audience. I really look forward for you to hear, especially Nicola Brophy's very moving presentation that she gives as someone who has experienced reproductive coercion within the context of a high controlling religious environment. And at the end, we will have a chance for discussion, and I hope to answer any questions you have. And Dr. Rod and Linda Dubrow-Marshall, who are both co-program leads of the University of Salford's program in the MSc Psychology of Coercive Control, will be joining me as panelists at our final discussion as well. So even if you have just questions on what coercive control is in general, we would be happy to answer those questions you have today. So thank you again. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and pull up my slides. So welcome to this program on reproductive coercion, policy and practice across contexts and communities. As I mentioned already, my name is Ashlyn Hilliard. I have an MSc in the Psychology of Coercive Control. Dr. Linda Dubrow-Marshall and Dr. Rod Dubrow-Marshall were my supervisors for the program, and they are the co-program leads. And I am very excited to share with you sort of my research into this area. So why talk about reproductive coercion at this social sciences event? As you may have heard, and as you well know, the fight for reproductive rights has been in headlines across the world. From the US Supreme Court's rulings to debates surrounding reproductive health in our local communities. We want to specifically look at the focus of reproductive coercion within the context of how theological beliefs, cultural factors, and/or abusive power dynamics in interpersonal relationships can all be used as means of controlling mechanisms surrounding reproductive choice. We feel that it's really important to learn from diverse experiences of those who suffered a loss of reproductive autonomy across these contexts. And it can help us, in turn, inform how we respond individually and as a community when we see those in need. First, I want to provide a little introductory into myself. I am someone who has experience working for multiple nonprofit settings in the field of cult recovery. I also assisted individuals leaving diverse polygamous communities out west. I worked for a nonprofit as a case manager and really got hands-on experience with those who were fresh out of cultic environments, who were in need of all kinds of different resources. After that, and after being with the International Cultic Studies Association for 3 years, I have recently started my own LLC called People Leave Cults, which provides intervention for families and victims of cults and coercive control. So with that being said, let's go ahead and proceed. The research that I did on reproductive coercion through the University of Salford, my dissertation was in the context of reproductive coercion and specifically how it impacts those within cultic groups. The title of my dissertation was The Relationship Between Reproductive Coercion, Psychologically Abusive Environments, and the Extent of Group Identity in a Sample of Those Who've Left Cultic Groups. This quantitative study is the first exploratory analysis of the complex experiences of individuals who have experienced reproductive coercion while under the influence of a cultic or destructive group setting. I sought with this research to fill an identifiable gap in the literature by specifically studying how reproductive coercion manifests in destructive group settings. What we do know about reproductive coercion has only been alluded to from survivor accounts. I pulled out segments from my literature review to help set the stage and introduce concepts surrounding reproductive coercion and help serve as an introduction into the topic as a whole. We'll discuss theological, ideological, and cultural factors that influence the likelihood of reproductive coercion, and of course creates environments for high control. It is important to note that high control systems exist on a spectrum. Not everyone involved in these groups experiences the same degrees of harm or would define their experience as a cult. Other terms that can be used to label one's experience instead of the term cult can be destructive group setting, high control system, or a spiritually abusive group. I use the term cult more generally when discussing the context of reproductive coercion and high control systems, because my quantitative data were from those who self-identified as having experienced a cultic environment and who had experienced reproductive coercion within that setting. So I just wanted to mention these things because you will hear me mention the term cult. And, it's important to note that there are some theological, ideological, and cultural factors that certainly can exist within cultic environments and can certainly exist on a spectrum of high control and create destructive systems that may compromise someone's autonomy. So with that being said, what is reproductive coercion? I really like this definition provided by Grace and Anderson. Reproductive coercion is a behavior that interferes with the autonomous decision-making of a woman with regard to reproductive health. It may take the form of birth control sabotage, pregnancy coercion, or controlling the outcome of pregnancy. I also wanted to break down the definition of reproductive coercion a little bit further. When we're talking about birth control sabotage, we're talking about a physical act of contraceptive interference, which may include removing or poking holes in condoms, removing IUDs, or discarding or hiding birth control pills. When we're looking at pregnancy coercion, present as a verbal or physical form of manipulation. This, of course, includes intimate partner violence. And controlling the outcome of pregnancy is also referred to as abortion coercion. This may include the pressure to terminate a pregnancy or force an abortion. But overall, studies demonstrate that individuals' inability to make their own reproductive choices compromises their future reproductive health decisions due to fear and a higher risk for unattended pregnancy, which was noted by researchers Miller. Reproductive can affect anyone, regardless of sex or gender. However, types of reproductive control can be sex or gender specific. In the case of women specifically, reproductive coercion may be perpetrated via sex that is coercive, unwanted, or non-consensual, and furthermore uses women's reproductive capacity as a weapon against them. I thought that this was a really powerful statement used by the researchers, Tarzia, Wellington, Moreno, and Haggerty. There's been more research done surrounding cults over the past 20 years, according to Rod and Linda Dubrow-Marshall. And of course, the studies on the prevalence of cults have specific challenges. So researching and gathering data on cults can be considered akin to researching hidden or hard to reach populations. Of course, because of the difficulty in obtaining information and the lack of interaction with public health programs, which provides little data on this particular subgroup. And reproductive coercion can exist on both the interpersonal and the structural level. On the interpersonal level, this could include, of course, the source of coercion from a current or former intimate relationship, parents, or extended relationships. On the structural domain, we're talking about societal, political, religious, socioeconomic, legislative, or cultural factors that may impact women's autonomy. So we're looking at numerous sources of influence. It's very interesting when you kind of bring this discussion together, and when you consider cultic environments, we're talking about reproductive coercion as sort of the confluence of both the interpersonal and structural domain. Prior research on reproductive coercion has typically focused on coercion from the intimate male partner, so the interpersonal domain, from research studies that have occurred in family planning clinics, healthcare settings, or amongst populations who are at a higher risk of intimate partner violence. Because of this, existing understandings in literature on reproductive coercion predominantly focus on the interpersonal domain and yield special attention to this type of coercion as being inflicted from current or former intimate relationships, partners, or extended friendships as being the source. In contrast, on the structural level, which is a much more broader area in need of further study, studying reproductive coercion, of course, involves investigating this sort of numerous sources of influence that may impact women's autonomy. There is also the consideration that individual experiences may not fall neatly into one domain that characterizes reproductive coercion. So, for example, both the influences in the structural sphere and the interpersonal pressures from extended family can present simultaneously. The confluence of these two domains can exist, particularly in abusive group settings that create environments that limit reproductive freedoms. And while existing studies on reproductive coercion have focused on the interpersonal domain, there has not been prior research on the complex experiences of individuals under the influence of a group environment, where there may be many variables that limit reproductive freedom. Specifically, how reproductive coercion manifests in destructive group settings has not yet been researched. And of course, what we have known about those who've experienced a lack of reproductive autonomy has only been alluded to from survivor accounts. So my research and the research presented seeks to fill the gaps surrounding experiences with reproductive coercion in cultic group settings. And conceptually, this phenomenon needs to be approached with a lens that can account for the many variables involved in a psychologically abusive group. Psychological abuse and group abuse often involve, of course, undue influence over the expression of sexuality, including reproductive decisions. There are many examples of this. One of those is cultic groups may impact reproductive decision-making by restricting or banning sex for group members through the teachings and influence of a cult leader, and religious or cultural factors that are significant in forming group practices and beliefs. These are just some examples that illustrate different mechanisms of control employed in abusive group settings that may limit women's reproductive health and decision-making, individual autonomy, and sexual well-being. What we do know as well is that research demonstrates that individuals who experience coercion in cults are more likely to present identity issues, depression, and anxiety in varying degrees, depending on several factors, such as a degree of identity placed in the totalist system. We know this thanks to Dr. Rod Dubrow Marshall's research on the extent of group identity. Reproductive coercion didn't land its place in the research literature until 2010, and it exclusively focused on females who visited family health planning clinics. There was this study done by Miller and colleagues, and since that hallmark study, the majority of research on reproductive coercion has continued to focus on that same demographic subset. While reproductive coercion has the potential to impact anyone, those who identified as female, especially during childbearing years, are the ones who are at most risk for experiencing this type of control and abuse. Reproductive coercion has also been described as a male behavior to control contraception and pregnancy outcomes of female partners, as termed by Clark, Allen, Goyle, Raker, and Gottlieb. This viewpoint reflects the data on reproductive coercion as existing in the interpersonal domain within intimate partner relationships, as we discussed. Of course, in contrast, it's much more difficult to obtain data that exists in the structural domain in the literature. IPV's relationship with reproductive coercion is a complex and often mutually reinforcing one, and it has led to reproductive coercion being referred to as IPV in the literature. Another perspective is that reproductive coercion can be categorized as a specific type of IPV. So moving on to factors that influence the likelihood of reproductive coercion. So the methods that cults employ to maintain power and control may be similar. However, the motivations for control may be unique to the particular culture of the group. While religious or faith-based high control groups are the main types of cults discussed in the literature, it is important to note that, of course, there are many different types of cultic groups that are not held by religious tenets or motivations. Religion is just one example of a cultural factor that may influence reproductive health and decision-making. Minimal research is actually available on cultural factors that drive reproductive coercion. There is research on cultural factors that can perpetuate an environment for both intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And this includes some of the following characteristics, which are often found in high control groups. This includes cultures that approve male violence, cultures that protect the good of the group at all cost, that include power hierarchies, and of course, patriarchal cultures. This research was done by Marie Stopes, Australia in 2018. I also wanted to make note of a few research studies that were done on in-law perpetuated abuse among women. There was one study that was done on women living in rural West Africa. And it was found that the cultural views may have influenced reproductive coercion and violence against women in the region, which demonstrates the power that culture can have in contributing to the risk of reproductive coercion. In that particular culture, women would bring great shame if they were infertile or do not wish to raise children. And this research interestingly sheds some light on the impact extended family and other relationships can have on reproductive health and decision making. It's very interesting in that the influence of in-law and extended family relationships, it's not often one that we think about or consider when discussing reproductive coercion, but I think it's a really important factor that needs to be mentioned. This study on rural women in West Africa was done by Gupta, Falb, Kabepo, and Enyen. The study itself resulted in advocating that community programs educate extended family systems to help with prevention, which is a really cool route, I think. There was also research done on cultural and linguistically diverse communities in Australia, which echoed similar results as the study mentioned on West African women. Researchers found that coercion can occur from broader family structures, and that several factors put individuals at risk as well, such as, of course, the importance of shame on an individual and community level can lead to a person's experience being secondary to the family or community's reputation. And again, think about this in the context of cultic environments. I feel like all of these things are perhaps stories or considerations that we've heard of from survivor accounts. Point number 2 is language and cultural barriers and a fear of repercussion if reproductive coercion is reported. There's the factor of uncertain legal status of a person experiencing coercion, stress and uncertainty of unemployment and a lack of job security, lack of financial resources or access to resources, and of course, the impact of social isolation, as noted by Marie Stopes, Australia. Now we're going to segue into undue influence and reproductive autonomy. The psychological impact of being under the influence of a destructive group has involved studies on former members of cults over time. One study that surveyed 157 participants found that groups that implement a restriction of freedom and enforce a punishment and reward system left the individuals with an increased likelihood of exhibiting symptoms of personal distress. This was a study done by Nishida and Kurado in 2004. And this is a relatively small sample size that was used for this study, but it certainly shows the significance when considering the effects that limiting reproductive autonomy may pose psychologically for those in a cultic environment. Psychological abuse and cultic group abuse often involve undue influence over the expression of sexuality, including reproductive decisions. Of course, more broadly, Robert Lifton, in his book Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, identified 8 criteria for thought reform that cults utilize when creating totalist systems for group members. So what I did was I took some of Lifton's criteria for thought reform and applied it to examples of coercion that can specifically target reproductive outcomes. For example, if you look at my first box there under milieu control, teaching that medical services are dangerous or misinforming individuals on the cost of medical services and care they would receive would be considered an aspect of milieu control. Moving on to demand for purity, this can be exhibited through discouraging associations with anyone outside of the group, including medical professionals, because they may be considered sinful, or threatening members who wish to seek medical counseling or services with forms of punishment. And finally, my last example could be instilling that a higher power has a plan, so personal action is frivolous. Maintaining power and control in a community or in a power dynamic involving a cult leader or controlling theology may be diverse and group specific. Within the context of reproductive coercion and psychologically abusive environments, the common theme that I was noticing within all of this when looking at the literature is the effect of the unbalance of social power in both instances. For example, within cultic systems, group ideology, a cult leader, or the group culture itself is the source of control, which limits decisions made during group involvement through undue influence. In the case of reproductive coercion, the source of control is from the current or former relationship, parents, extended family relationships, or structural influences that intend to interfere. And again, there's that intent. There's an intent to interfere with decision making. This unbalance of social power strips women's rights to reproductive health care and well-being in the scope of this review. So thank you so much for sitting in and learning a little bit about my research, my study on reproductive coercion. I now want to turn the time over to Nicola Brophy as she gives a very moving presentation through photography as to her experiences with RC. And I challenge audience members to, now that you know a little bit of the lay of the land when it comes to reproductive coercion, and who especially may be more vulnerable to reproductive coercion, I'd be interested to hear in the discussion after you listen to Nicola's story, what your thoughts were on her experiences with reproductive coercion, where the sources of control were coming from. And I hope that it is useful for you to hear an example of how it can occur in a community in which a high controlling religious group is dominant.
Okay, my name's Nicola Brophy, and I'm a photographer from Lancashire in the UK. I was brought up as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as the Mormons. And that has always really informed my work as I did photography. It's quite interesting because I only recently decided that I no longer believed in that religion. And so looking back at my work from before, it's quite interesting now when I see it from a different perspective. So my practice in photography was very much based on kind of my life in the church. And I was always trying to kind of show what it was like to be in the church without ever really being able to be as clear as I would like because of the sacredness of some of the things in the church and the things that were seen as not talked about. There was a certain image that needed to be presented. And so it was an interesting kind of dynamic trying to show something that couldn't really be shown. And I think that's what I found so interesting. But it's gone the other way around now, where now I feel like it's showing something that couldn't be shown, but in a new context. I'm reading the image in a new way, which is, it's definitely an interesting experience to do that. So with me being brought up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I was never really fully a part of school life, fully a part of like my friend's life. I was very much in this one kind of culture. And even though my parents looked after me really, really well, and they taught me a lot about respect and about individualism and things like that, I was always taught from a very young age that I had to give everything to God and that my life wasn't really my own. And so I always had this kind of knowledge that I could enjoy these things that I liked exploring, like art and literature, and the things I loved learning about, like psychology, sociology, and history, but that there was something that was a reality, and that was God's plan. And so those things were kind of nice ideas, but they weren't the truth. And I was brought up kind of like that, this idea that the truth was that God had a plan for me, and that was to be someone's wife, to be someone's mother, to stay faithful in the church, to go to the temple, be married there, and take out certain ordinances in that temple. And so it was interesting because I think at the time where I actually came to a point where I could do that, I'd never really been interested in like a lot of people to marry or date. But when I did finally find someone that I was interested in, I kind of dropped everything in my life that made me who I am, that I've been developing, all the knowledge that I'd got outside the church, and I just literally had to be like, I literally became instead a wife, and then my next thing that I had to do was to be a mother. And it was quite a shock to the system, if I'm going to be honest, even though I've been preparing my whole life for it. I didn't actually ever really want to do it, and it caused a lot of distress, to be honest, that I didn't realize was distress because of that reason until later on in life, and also until looking at these images that I took while I was still in the church. I think the imagery I created is very recognizable to anyone who is a member of this church, no matter where they're from. They will be able to see it and understand and recognize the imagery and where it's from. And with that, I think is very, I think it's quite interesting that that is a language in itself, these symbols and images from this particular culture in the church. And so I feel that it would be understood what I mean of the before and the after with these images, of how I felt before with them and how I now feel after, in a way that maybe someone who isn't part of the church may not understand quite at the same level. So with looking at my images, I wanted to photograph the things that were showing the temple, the obedience, the reverence, all these things about this church I was in, without being obviously able to show that emotion, without showing what's inside the temple. And so here is a photograph of my temple recommend holder. So it's not even showing my temple recommend, but this is the thing that I fold my temple recommend into, so that when I go to the temple, I can present it to someone at the desk and they can scan it and know that I'm worthy to enter the temple. So this temple recommend, you have to obtain through an interview with the bishop and with the stake president. So with two separate people, and you have to answer questions about your actions, your thoughts, your allegiances, your sins, to see if you are able to be worthy to go to the temple. And it does include things like, did you drink coffee? Do you believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet? Do you believe that the current prophet speaks for God and is the prophet? Do you believe in God and Jesus Christ? And also, do you pay full tithing? So you kind of have, those are just some of them. There are a lot more. And by answering these questions with the affirmative, you're then able to be given the temple recommend and seen as worthy to go into the temple. And so I thought that was a really interesting one to show. So the reason this temple recommend was so important to me, I think, was because it was something I had longed for a long time. And it's not something that is seen as easy to obtain, but it's almost like the highest you can obtain as a woman in the church anyway, is to be endowed in the temple and then sealed in marriage to a priesthood holder. And so this is what I've been kind of told was the ultimate goal my whole life since I was a child, since I was singing songs about, I want to see the temple, I'm going there someday. That even though I didn't even know what happened in the temple, all the way up until I actually went to the temple, which was at the age of 26. So for 26 years, all I knew is that I had to get to that temple. I had to be worthy to go to that temple. The clothes I wore, the things I said, what I watched, what I read, who I affiliated with, all of these things had to be to a certain standard if I was going to be able to get this temple recommend, which would then let me get into the temple to then be endowed and then sealed. And so I guess to me, it was an object of great importance, especially because I wasn't massively interested in dating, but I was interested in going to the temple and getting endowed because everyone said how amazing it was since I was a child. And one thing that I've really discovered about myself, that I didn't really understand while I was in the church, was that I actually wasn't that keen on being a mother and a wife. I could never have admitted that or said it, but I never really wanted to find a boy to date. I just knew I had to. It was very much of, this is what I have to do. This is the plan. But it wasn't something that I myself would have sat down and said I wanted to do if I was ever given the choice. And so when it came to this idea of being able to do the highest thing, this idea of being able to go and be endowed in the temple of God, like, I was really eager to do that, just like regardless of whether it involved a righteous priesthood holder or not. And so I would often ask my bishop, because you can, as a woman, get an endowment in the temple, or if you're going on a mission for the church, or if you're getting married. They try not to encourage women to go and get an endowment unless those things are happening. But all I knew is that I wanted to be endowed. They would give endowments to women who were perhaps of a certain age where they felt that they were perhaps not going to get married. There's definitely a lot of stigmatism around being a single older woman in the church, and it kind of holds you back from many of the things that are talked about at church and the blessings that you are said and that you can receive. So I always wanted to prove that I was worthy enough on my own, I guess. And so I'd constantly be asking my bishop, could I please go for my temple endowment? And he would say, you need to wait until you meet someone and you're going to be getting married to them. And I would go, okay, but I really feel strongly that I would like to do it. And they go, we feel really strongly that it would be inappropriate for you to do it under these circumstances. And so I had been wanting this temple recommend for years, to be able to actually go to a temple and find out what happened in the temple for years and years. And I'd always been told, you'll find out one day, you'll go there with whoever you marry. And it kind of frustrated me that I didn't get to go on my own before and do it on my own. I had to do it only when I was getting married. But it did turn out that when I was 26, I did get married, and I was able to then receive my own endowment in the temple and be sealed. For me, I kind of felt a lot of pressure, I guess, not just in the fact that I had to get married, but in the fact that if I wanted to have more activity and involvement in the church and to go to the next level of righteousness, which is being worthy to go to the temple, that marriage was pretty much the only way to do it. And I felt like time was ticking. As a 26-year-old, you definitely feel this kind of weight that once you get to 30, you're maybe not going to get married, you're not going to find anyone, you'll be too old, and that anyone that you find will be interested in a younger woman. And that kind of does happen because there are more women in the church than men, so they do have their pick, and often will go for younger women. And there's a lot of single sisters in the church. And so there is a pressure that you can't really get on with your life until you found that person, and you've got made to feel like you're not worth as much as everyone else. You're made to feel that you maybe just don't understand things like everyone else, and it's a shame, but maybe one day you will. So in the temple, you wear white. Everyone wears white. The men wear white suits with white ties, white shoes with white soles on the bottom of the shoes. Women will wear white accessories. Everything is white. And there's a few things about the temple to do with clothing that people don't show very readily. In fact, they wouldn't show at all. They're seen as very sacred, very private, and things not to be talked about and seen. by people not worthy to see them on outside of the temple. And so I guess my way of wanting to show the temple clothes and what happens in the temple a little bit was by showing my mother's temple clothes folded with her white temple shoes on the top. When I took this photograph, I was still active, an active member of the church. I was still attending the temple. And also, when I took this photo, my mother was still alive, and she has since passed away from ovarian cancer. And so this image has changed its meaning a lot for me. I found this image really compelling because it represented to me my mother's faith in the church and her temple attendance and sacrifice during really hard times as she went through her cancer, as she went through raising us as children. It was a symbol of like her worthiness to me, and her temple shoes are well worn, and that showed a lot to me. It was representing all the work and effort she'd put into this church, into being righteous, into raising me in this church, into attending the temple. So at the time when I was trying to represent my feelings of the temple in that small amount, this really worked for me. Things being folded and not fully shown, keeping the sacred secrets and yet expressing the quietness. But now the image is very different. Now Mum's gone and I have lost my faith in the religion she raised me in. So the reverence and the awe that I felt before is kind of replaced by an emptiness, where that meaning used to be. So this image to me now shows a space where that meaning and my faith once was. And I'm no longer following in the steps of my mother's well-worn shoes, and I no longer have that reverence towards this religion that I felt was the only thing to follow. Yeah, I think a lot. I wasn't actually able to even think about the idea of questioning my faith until a while after my mother's death, because I realised how important it was for me to, while Mum was ill and while she was going through hard times, to be a righteous, faithful daughter, that no matter what happened, that she could see that I was living the teachings that she had taught me, that I was attending the temple with her when I could. These things were really important to her, and there was no chance I was going to do anything about that while she was here. But I was surprised because it was actually in her passing that I think I really understood how I felt about God, about these religious beliefs. And I remember because a lot of the ideas about the afterlife in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is about this idea that you will carry on working, that you will, it's not so much that you're going to rest, it's that if you can be righteous enough to make it to the highest tier of the celestial kingdom, which is the top of the 3 kingdoms of glory, if you can be righteous enough to make it there, that you're going to just be getting on with more things, like you'll be part of eternal families, making more children, creating your own kind of families, and there's a lot within that isn't talked about, of course, because there's the idea obviously of eternal polygamy. There's this idea of creating planets and worlds. A lot of these things are contested or talked about, but it's kind of sounds like a lot of work. It just sounds like a lot of work. And I just remember the idea that my mother hadn't, let me rephrase that. There's this idea that a lot of people had, oh, your mum's there in the afterlife, she's there in the spirit world, she's teaching everyone about the gospel, she's working hard. And that sounded horrible to me. I just thought, my mum loved to just sit and read a book or sit and sew. And I just really hated the idea that she could just have passed away, had this really traumatic thing happen, and she was just set straight back to work. And so for me, a great comfort actually came from the idea that that hadn't happened at all. There was no comfort in the idea that she was still going on and that she was now another part of this whole big plan I just wanted her to rest. And so I wanted, and that felt better. The idea that in fact, that she hadn't gone anywhere, that she hadn't continued to exist, was actually more comforting to me than any of the religious kind of meanings that a lot of people want to find in death. Those worn out shoes of my mum, who worked hard, sacrificed so many things for me and for her husband and for for herself. Like I just didn't like the idea of her having to keep on doing that. And when I realized that I didn't like that idea, that I didn't want to go to that afterlife, it spoke a lot to me. Especially because my husband had stopped going to church, and I have been taught my whole life that I would then not be able to be with him in the afterlife. So it was very difficult. I knew that my mother was seen as being really righteous and that she was seen as going to the top part of the celestial kingdom, and I would want to be with her. Then I had my husband, who had denied the church, who no longer believed in it, who had no chance of going to the celestial kingdom, and I would be leaving him to be with my mom. I was very torn between the two things, and just the idea that I wouldn't have to deal with any of that was just so comforting. It was just this picture now, even though it is emptiness, that might seem very sad to a lot of people, but to me, I feel like this image shows that my mother is finally resting, that there is peace. And while it's sad probably to lots of people that still believe that my mother's legacy is not being carried on by me, that I am not working hard in the gospel, I have to do what's right for me, and I just don't feel the way that she did. So alongside like my mother's temple clothes, I have this dress, which is my own temple dress that I would wear to the temple. And I really like this picture because it reminded me of a picture by my favorite photographer. I thought about his work a lot when I was doing this project. And this is the dress that my mum once wore when she went on this big diet and lost weight, and then she bought a new temple dress, and then she did regain the weight, and so could no longer wear it, and so I got the dress. And I really liked it because it was hers at one point. And like looking at it now, it's very similar to that shoe image where it's kind of disembodied. It's hanging up there as if it's got a life, but there's no one in it, and so that emptiness is kind of there still. And it's quite interesting because the thing that strikes me the most about this image is actually the fact that it was taken at a time that was very important to me, in a house that held a lot of meaning. So the house I lived in was next door to my mum and dad, and I lived there with my husband when my children were being born and were small. We were very dependent upon my parents and the church at this point because we didn't have a lot of money. We'd got married because that's what you did when you found someone that you liked enough. You couldn't live with them. You couldn't have intimate relationships with them. You couldn't really do anything until you got married. And so we got married, and then once you're married, you're supposed to have children. And so we did that, but it also meant that we didn't have a lot of money, and we didn't have a lot of stability. And so we were very much dependent upon my mum and dad. We lived next door, and there was a lot to juggle at that time. We were both still going through our education at different points during those years, and we were trying to juggle really our first serious relationship. Like, I had never been in a serious relationship before I married Colin, and I'd never lived with anyone else. And so I was dealing with that and the intimacy that came with it, dealing with having infant children and pregnancy, dealing with work and study, and then we were dealing with my husband's faith crisis that he had at this time, and my mother's terminal illness. And this house, I often think of this picture because this was where a lot of my real mental health problems happened, as I was trying to juggle all these things. So this is the entrance to the kitchen, and I remember this kitchen because that is where I laid on the floor and able to move, because this feeling inside of me kept making it so I was unable to breathe or think. It's often where I cried for hours, and it's also where I learned to hit myself to stop the feeling and to make myself wake up enough to carry on and keep juggling. And all the time while this is going on, I was there with this mask of like trying to be a kind mother, an understanding wife, a submissive, helpful child to my parents, a wise friend and hostess to my friends. And I was waking up every day in this house knowing that I was already a failure and that I would never be able to catch up. And so this house was a really painful place for me, because I really feel that those mental health issues came from the fact that I was not ready for any of those things, that I didn't have any choices to do otherwise, because I had to get married to be with the person that I wanted to be in a relationship with. And once I was married, I had to have children. And once I was having children, I couldn't work, and Colin had to be the main provider. My husband had to be the main provider. There was this life that I knew I was supposed to live, and there wasn't really an alternative. And to give an example of why there wasn't really an alternative, while I was having my children, my mental health really was quite bad, and I was missing my education in photography that I'd had before. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I was losing my identity, and I really wanted to do a master's in photography. I felt I wasn't done, and this is where this all came in. This project was within my master's, and so I was really excited to start this master's, and we hadn't had any children yet. We weren't expecting any babies. We didn't know about my mum's health, but I remember I would go to church and I would have people that I'd known almost all my life say to me, "Oh, how are you doing?" And I'd start to tell them, it was one particular incident. I told her, "Oh, I'm starting my master's. I'm really excited. I really, really am excited to start this." And she said to me, she said, "Well, you shouldn't put off having children, because if you don't, there's a child waiting up there for you, and if you don't have it, it will go to someone else." And I already felt really bad because I hadn't become instantly pregnant since getting married, even though I had no idea what I was doing with intimacy at all. And I already felt selfish for doing that. I already felt that I was doing something outside the norm in the first place by even choosing to do a master's. And I remember going home and just crying that I was doing the wrong thing, that I was being seen as not fulfilling my roles that I should fill. But literally as soon as I started my master's, I found out I was pregnant with my first child, and we found out that my mum was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And so actually the master's turned out to be the thing that saved me, because even though I was juggling all these things, it was the master's that allowed me to go into university, talk to other people that didn't only want to know about like my roles as a mother and as a wife. It was where I was able to go into the dark room, and the dark room was just the most wonderful place to be. The sound of the water, the smell of the chemicals, the ticking of the clock as I waited for the images to develop. There's just nothing like it. That place saved me from it being even worse at home, from what I was feeling, because that was where my identity lay. And my husband would always say to me when I came home from doing something with with my masters or doing a workshop or learning something new, he'd always say, "Oh, you're always so much more yourself when you come home from those things." And I was always so much mentally better, and I didn't really understand why. We just thought, oh, it's because I'm getting to do something that I feel confident in. We thought it was about my confidence, but the reality was that I didn't want the role that I had been given, and I never even contemplated the fact that there was a choice in it. But I'm so grateful that I was able to do that alongside it because of my husband, who was supportive, and because of, I guess, the help people have given me. But these images now, it's just very interesting because at that time I just wanted to hang up that dress to show my white dress fully, to have it like this image that I wanted, and it was very aesthetic, my reasoning behind it. And yet it just brings me right back to that time and place where I was in that house. It was a very hard time. Yeah, it was a very hard time. I think that finally, I think I'll just have a look at this image. There are other images in the series. Some of them are involving people's faces. But I want to make sure that this is only about me. I don't want anyone to feel that they've been brought into it. But this image I felt was really important because when I took it at the time, I was just at the chapel and I saw it in my stake president's office. And it's an old replica of the first Book of Mormon printed. And it's a little ornament of the angel Moroni. And history is a really big thing where I'm from for the church. Preston, especially Liverpool, those areas are seen as like real places where the faithful saints came from. Like there's a village nearby where the whole village packed up and left to go to America to join the pioneers on their trek to Utah and to join the church. There's a lot of, I think Preston ward is the oldest, it's like one of the oldest wards in the whole of the church, because the oldest standing one, it's never changed, it's always been there in Preston and it's not been shut down. And so there's a lot of history in this area, and a lot of the people I went to church with were really proud of this history, with having the temple built there as well. There's a lot of history from like a previous prophet who served as mission in the UK, and there's a lot of pride in our, especially our English and Scottish ancestors. And so it's very interesting looking at this and having that feeling of pride be a completely different feeling, more one of embarrassment and shame, and feeling foolish for having not known these true histories and having spent about 34 years of my life fully entrenched in this church. And it also reminds me of how hard it is to disentangle those things from my mind, to know what is true, to understand what parts that I've been taught about life, the world, about history, about science, about the arts, about what those things actually are, because all I know is what I was taught through this church, and I no longer trust its narrative or its history.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing those images with us. They were incredibly moving, and I'm sure that those watching would agree that we can truly feel your emotions, your experiences through these artistic images. And so thank you so much for sharing such a huge part of your journey with us through this particular work of art. It is really, really meaningful.
Thank you.
I just had a few questions regarding, coming back to this concept of reproductive coercion. You did an excellent job with guiding us through the pressures that were involved where they perhaps came from. In my research, I talk a lot about theological forms of pressures that can occur with reproductive coercion, and those often aren't talked about. Many a times when we talk about reproductive coercion, it's from the intimate partner. And in your case, it was not the case. It came from other perhaps women in the church, from the church's doctrine and expectations of women up to a certain age. Even you were treated differently, like time is running out kind of a thing, to fulfill your purpose. And you did a really excellent job at highlighting where these different sources of influence came from. My question to you is, oftentimes when we're in these systems, we don't even know about other choices available to us. I often get asked, when people are in these groups, why don't they just leave? I think you did a wonderful job at explaining that, even through your images, how much this affected your family system, family's involvement. Starting from a young age, that was your reality. That was what you were supposed to do. And you did a wonderful job at fulfilling those expectations. When it came to reproductive health choices and well-being, if you didn't, fulfill those pressures, those different influences, what would things maybe look like for you now if you were still in the group?
It's hard to know fully, but I don't know if I would have left home. The idea of, I had toyed with the idea of moving to Manchester and working in galleries, and like, I did have these ideas, but they always kind of were done with this idea of, oh well, I haven't found anyone in Chorley or where I live, so I need to go further afield to find someone. So it was always with this purpose of, maybe the Lord is guiding me like to find the right person that I'm supposed to marry. But I do remember being really, really excited at the idea that I could move out with some friends and go and start working in a city and stuff. But then actually I had something strange happen. My bishop of my ward said, when I was telling him about I wanted to do this, he said to me, oh well, there's a family moving into the ward and they have an older son that's near your age. Why don't you wait and see? Why don't you just not move out and wait and see? And so I thought, well, there's my bishop. He knows, he speaks to God. He knows me, he can receive revelation from me, and he's a good man. And he's a really good man. And I trusted him, and I thought, you know what, if he's saying it, then I'm going to stay. And I didn't go anywhere. I finished my degree, and then I worked in a sweet shop that was awful, an awful job that I hated. And I met Colin, who I then married, because I felt that it was all guided. And thankfully, Colin and I are very much in love. We've been together for 10 years and we've made it work. But the reality is that I trusted my bishop that this person that came in to my life was going to be the person I'd been waiting for. And so I don't know, it's very difficult to know what my life would have been like, because I feel like so much of it would have been led by those things in my life that were leading me towards a future spouse, whether it was the patriarchal blessing that I received as a 16-year-old, which everyone receives in the church, which tells you about how your life is going to be if you're righteous. That told me that about the person that I was going to marry. So obviously I was going to marry someone because my blessing mentioned it. And my leaders would always be trying to direct me towards meeting someone. So if I hadn't have stayed where I was and met Colin and married him, I feel that I would have just been led in a similar way to someone else that may not have worked out as well.
Yeah. And you are so fortunate in that your partner is someone who you are in love with, and that is wonderful. So I'm really happy to hear that has.
Thank you. It was hard at first. It was very hard marriage at first. But yeah, we're proud of where we've come now.
Yeah, that's incredible. And when it comes to, you've talked about, you know, the physicalities of, you know, perhaps if this happened, maybe I'd be here, maybe I'd be doing this. What would the spiritual consequences, or I guess ramifications, have been if you didn't get married, didn't have children? What, if any, would the spiritual ramifications be for you in the afterlife?
Well, I never really got quite as emotional as other women did about the idea of being single. I liked my own space. I didn't necessarily feel like I wanted to get married, but I knew that that's what I had to do. So that's what would make me feel upset about the fact that it wasn't happening. But like, as a single woman in the church, you are very much pitied, very much. You're seen as someone who will get a better chance in the next life. Like, oh, don't worry, you'll have a family in the next life. You'll be able to raise children in the next life, because that is what heaven is seen as being, is having children. Being a mother and a wife is heaven. And it's so sad that even though you're a lawyer, you haven't had children. It's really like so patronizing, but that is how it felt. And you just don't, you're not really seen as having authority experience or anything like that if you're not a wife and a mother, if you do not have a priesthood holder. And there's also this idea that, like, as I was saying previously about that kind of hidden polygamy element, there's this idea that if you don't get married now, that like God will look after it in the next life, and you're not really sure what that could be, but there is a chance that it could be that you are given to someone who already has a wife. And so there's this kind of fear, this kind of like unknown, but you're being told the whole time that this is what will make you happy, so you have to be righteous, because then you will finally be happy when you get to this point of being able to be someone's wife and a mother. Yeah, that's pretty much, I think, what it is to be a single woman in the church, from what I have experienced and seen. But obviously there are women that I've known that are single, that are older, and that have done fantastic things, that maybe would answer that differently, and have been able to make fantastic lives for themselves and brush that nonsense aside, hopefully.
Yeah. So what you said was, you know, being a wife and a mother was heaven, or equals heaven. I think really says it all, doesn't it, about expectations and
Yeah.
pressures. And do you truly feel like you have autonomy over your own life and choices when that sort of pressure and expectation is forced upon you? In conclusion, I think my final question, and what I would leave with those viewing this, is I would love for you to just really briefly, you know, tell people what drew you to participate in this particular project, but also, if you don't mind sharing, what are you doing now with your art? Like, I would love for you to share what you're up to at this point in your journey.
Well, thank you. Well, the thing that led me to this project was that I'm actually on to do art therapy as an MA in this autumn, this fall. And a lot of it is to do with the fact that I look back on my photography and I could see the meaning and see the change, and to see that I put a lot of myself into my own artwork. And so I could see that I've been doing art therapy throughout my whole practice. From before, every single project that I did was about the church, about being a Mormon woman, about my time at Brigham Young University, about all these different elements. And so the hard thing now is this idea of what am I doing now? I don't actually know how to almost not talk about the church. All my work has been about the church, and so it's been very hard to then create new work while I was going through this transition in my faith. But I understood the importance of creating work, which is why I'm doing the MA. However, through this and through talking to you about this reproductive coercion, being able to see that in my imagery, I'm going to be starting doing photography again, and I'm going to be doing a project about objects that hold power in the life of ex-Mormons, and the power that those things held over them, because I can see that in my own work, that these objects, that these images and symbols, they were filled with meaning, they were filled with promises, they were filled with expectation and weight, and I'm really interested in being a part of a community that encourages people to work through the similar things that I've gone through. And so that's kind of what I'll be working on. And when I saw all your work and what this project was, to me, I just felt like it was just perfect for me. I just felt like I understood completely what you were trying to do. And I agreed completely with what you were saying. And I wanted to be a part of sharing that, so that other people that were maybe feeling the same way maybe didn't feel so alone.
Thank you so much, Nicola. This has been just such a truly, I feel like a very vulnerable thing for you to share, and yet I know that others will relate to this. Perhaps Mormon, ex-Mormon, not even Mormon, maybe other people who are in different religious systems or family structures, or even under the influence of extended family members who are maybe pressuring them. And it's making things confusing. And I just really appreciate you sharing not only your personal story, but your art, because art can truly be a vulnerable form of expression and a thing to share. And it was incredibly moving. So thank you so much again.
Thank you.
It was lovely to connect with you and to bring you onto this project.
Thank you so much for letting me be a part of it.